Hey, look around. Yeah, you felt that pause, didn't you? That tight silence. That's not anticipation. That's fear pretending to be calm because they lost control. And once control slips, the truth doesn't whisper anymore. It bleeds. You see, for the longest time, they survived on one fragile illusion, that you wouldn't notice, that you'd stay distracted, that you'd keep swallowing the story exactly as it was served, neatly plated, carefully censored, emotionally sedated. But something changed. You changed. And now the walls are sweating secrets. They didn't plan for this part. They never do. They planned for compliance. They planned for silence. They planned for obedience dressed up as normal. What they didn't plan for was pressure. Pressure cracks masks. Pressure turns whispers into leaks. Pressure exposes who's been lying, who's been watching, and who's been pulling strings from the dark while smiling in the light. And oh, how they smiled. They smiled while telling you to wait. They smiled while telling you to trust. They smiled while tightening the cage one polite rule at a time. But here's the joke. The kind that makes kings nervous and clowns immortal. You were never asleep. You were watching, learning patterns, noticing contradictions, feeling that itch in your spine when something didn't line up. And once one thread got pulled, everything started unraveling. Now look at them. Scrambling, over-explaining, backtracking, contradicting yesterday with today, while hoping you won't rewind the tape. They're not angry because you're wrong. They're angry because you're seeing too much. Truth doesn't need permission. Truth doesn't knock. Truth shows up like a crime scene nobody cleaned properly. And suddenly everyone's shoes are dirty. That's why the reactions feel frantic. The sudden clarifications, the rushed narratives, the emotional overreactions to simple questions. Because questions are dangerous. Questions don't attack, they expose. And once exposure starts, control evaporates. See, control only works when people doubt themselves. When they think, maybe it's just me. When they gaslight their own instincts into silence. But the moment you trust what you feel, the moment you say, no, this doesn't make sense, the whole system starts shaking. That's why the truth isn't being released carefully anymore. It's leaking. Accidentally, sloppily. Through cracks they pretended weren't there. And every leak confirms what you already suspected. The narrative was never as solid as they claimed. They needed you confused. They needed you divided. They needed you doubting your own perception while accepting theirs as law. But now you're watching them panic. And panic is honest. Panic reveals priorities. Panic reveals fear. Panic reveals who was never in control to begin with. This is the part they don't show in the polished version of history. The moment power realizes it's being observed, because once the audience sees behind the curtain, the magic trick dies. And that's the real reason the truth feels so loud right now, so messy, so impossible to ignore. It's not that everything suddenly broke. It's that it was always broken. And you finally stopped looking away. So laugh if you want, smile if it burns. Because the greatest joke of all, they thought they were playing you, turns out you were the punchline they never saw coming. And once the truth starts bleeding, there's no way to put it back inside the lie. Because once the truth starts bleeding out everywhere, it doesn't stop at exposure. It moves into infection. Every lie it touches begins to rot. Every false hero starts sweating. Every authority that survived on confidence alone suddenly sounds shaky. That's why they're yelling now. That's why the tone changed. That's why calm explanations turned into aggressive certainty. Power always gets louder right before it loses its grip. They're not trying to convince you anymore. They're trying to convince themselves. Watch closely. This is the tell. When truth leaks, control responds with chaos disguised as order. Rules multiply, narratives harden, dissent gets labeled instead of answered. Because labels are easier than accountability, they don't want debate, they want closure. Not because the story is complete, but because they're terrified you'll keep asking, why? Why did this change? Why now? Why doesn't yesterday match today? Why does every explanation require you to forget the last one? And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The truth isn't just bleeding out there, it's bleeding inside people. Inside the ones who defended the lie, inside the ones who enforced it, inside the ones who built their identity on believing they were on the right side. That's why the reactions feel personal. Because it is personal. When a lie collapses, it doesn't just destroy systems, it shatters self-images. And not everyone survives that intact. Some double down, some attack messengers, some pretend nothing's happening while everything burns behind their eyes. But a few, a dangerous few, start waking up. Those are the ones they fear most. Not rebels, not enemies, but former believers who finally connect the dots. Because once someone sees the pattern, you can't unsee it. You notice how emergencies are always convenient, how villains are always vague, how solutions always require obedience first and understanding later. You notice how truth is always too complex when it threatens power. But simple slogans are fine when they control you. And suddenly the performance looks cheap, the confidence looks rehearsed, the authority looks human. Fragile, defensive, desperate. That's the moment control officially dies. Not with a bang, but with awareness. And awareness spreads faster than fear ever did. That's why they're rushing to plug leaks. That's why contradictions are being memory holed. That's why the past is being rewritten in real time. Because if you remember accurately, they lose. And here's the part they never accounted for. You don't need to overthrow anything. You don't need to scream. You don't need permission. All you have to do is see clearly. Clarity is lethal to lies. Once you stop reacting emotionally to their panic, once you stop internalizing their urgency, once you realize that the chaos isn't yours, you become untouchable. That's why the truth feels like it's bleeding everywhere now. Because lies can't survive indifference mixed with awareness. So let it bleed. Let the contradictions stack. Let the masks slip. Let the truth stain everything they tried to keep clean. Because history doesn't remember who screamed the loudest. It remembers who stayed standing when the illusion collapsed, and when the dust settles, when the panic fades. When control finally realizes it's not coming back, they won't ask who exposed us. They'll ask, trembling, when did they stop believing us? Because once disbelief takes root, it doesn't grow quietly. It spreads in silence, in glances, in pauses between words. People stop rushing to defend. They stop arguing on command. They stop feeling that reflexive need to explain away the cracks. That's when power really starts to feel cold. Because power feeds on reaction, anger, fear, outrage, applause. But indifference starves it. And now you can see it happening in real time. The overproduced certainty, the forced confidence, the rehearsed empathy that arrives a second too late. They keep talking, but fewer people are listening. And that silence, that's not ignorance, that's evaluation. You don't need proof spoon-fed anymore. You don't need permission to question. You don't need a villain monologue to know something's off. You've learned to read between the updates, to hear what isn't said, to notice what gets avoided instead of answered. That's growth. That's danger to them. Because systems aren't toppled by force first. They rot from awareness. Every time someone says, "Wait, that doesn't add up," a thread snaps. Every time someone refuses to be emotionally hijacked, a lever breaks. And suddenly the whole machine feels heavier to run. That's why the truth keeps bleeding. Through mistakes, through leaks, through accidental honesty that slips out when the script glitches. You can hear it in the tone shifts, the sudden defensiveness, the way questions get framed as threats instead of curiosity. Truth doesn't fear questions, only control does. And the wild part? You're not angry like they expected. You're not hysterical. You're not even shocked anymore. You're calm. Calm enough to notice patterns. Calm enough to wait. Calm enough to let them expose themselves while trying to maintain the illusion. That calm terrifies them. Because rage can be redirected, fear can be managed. But clarity? Clarity doesn't move when pushed. So they escalate urgency. They accelerate timelines. They demand trust now, explanations later. That's the oldest trick in the book. But you've read it already. And here's the quiet truth hiding under all the noise. Nothing powerful collapses the moment it's exposed. It collapses the moment people stop pretending. Stop pretending the story makes sense. Stop pretending confidence equals truth. Stop pretending confusion is a personal failure instead of a signal. That's why this moment feels heavy. Why it feels like something irreversible is happening. Because it is. Not out there. Inside perception itself. Once perception shifts, reality follows. So let them scramble. Let them patch. Let them shout certainty into a room that's learned how to listen differently. You're not watching chaos. You're watching control realize it no longer owns the narrative. And when that realization fully lands, when the truth finishes bleeding through every layer they painted over, there's no dramatic ending, just a quiet one, where people look at each other and think, "Oh, so it was never us."